Shalom and welcome to Secrets Revealed, the Holy Bible. Today we're looking at Leviticus chapter 12. There are only 8 verses in this chapter, beginning in verse 2 for her monthly courses versus her infirmity. This is a big difference because in the Sept, it's describing a woman's monthly cycle. And that's exactly what it's saying. It's a monthly course. It's a monthly cycle. The Maz is saying it's a sickness. It's an infirmity. She's sick. This is an illness. It's not normal. So you can see there's a big contrast. This is a normal pattern. It's not an illness. It's not something abnormal. It's something that God had designed and created, and it's perfectly normal. It's good. Verse 3, she shall, it says here, she shall circumcise the flesh of his foreskin, talking about her son that she gives birth to. She's going to circumcise the flesh. This is omitted completely uh, from the Maz. I'm just going to qualify these. These are big differences. So it's not just anybody that is supposed to circumcise a male child. It's the mother. The mother does it. And apparently back in this time, they knew how to do it. So they were something of surgeons as well. They could do this procedure, the women, the mothers could. And this is 8 days after. So it's not the day of. It's not like she's just popping a baby out and then, doing surgery. No, she's able to recover in 8 days. And I think 8 days is a reasonable amount of time. We have some hospitals, some places where a woman would give birth and she's out the next day or the same day. But you know what? 8 days, I think that's a reasonable amount of time for her to be able to do this procedure, and she would be trained in doing it. Or maybe her mother would teach her. I'm not sure how this works, but that's what it says here. She shall circumcise. Verse 5, female versus a maid. So if she gives birth to a female child versus a maid, and then it says according to the time of her monthly courses versus as in her separation. And then we see here unclean blood versus purifying. And the context of this is for 66 days she shall remain in her unclean blood. Now, this is the amount of time that a woman will separate herself after giving birth to a female child. So it's a lot different than when she gives birth to a male child. And I believe it says here 33 days she'll be separated. But when it comes to giving birth to a female child, it's going to be 66 days. That's interesting. And then look at in verse 5 of the Maz, it says, she shall be unclean 2 weeks. Okay. So it says the same thing in both. She'll be unclean twice 7 days for the female child, and then 66 days she will remain in her unclean blood. Whereas we see with when she gives birth to a male child, it's half the amount. It's only 7 days, and she'll be unclean according to the days of her separation of her monthly courses, and then it goes on to say 33 days unclean blood. Okay, this is actually a pretty deep topic. You know what? To be honest, I don't know the full depth and breadth of this topic. It's not something I'm an expert in. I'm just explaining to you uh, the differences that I found. So, anyone else has more knowledge about this topic than me, feel free to comment. I would appreciate that. So, next we see in verse 7 the word fountain. She shall purge her from the fountain of her blood versus the issue of her blood. Uh, so, I suppose there is more blood than you would think, than just a little issue, like a little cut. This is some women bleed heavier than others when it comes to the menstrual cycle. And then the last verse we're going to look at is verse 8. It says, she will take 2 turtle doves versus 2 turtles. So it's important to know that I know that that's what it says here in the Mass. And what they mean in the Old English, they don't mean reptile turtles, with the shell. That's not what they mean. Back in that time in 1611, turtles meant turtle doves. That was just an understanding. So I'm not saying this is a big mistranslation. This is something I just need to explain because in our modern vernacular, we don't understand that word turtle the same way as they did back then. It meant turtle doves. So I need to qualify that. Okay, so moving on to the next chapter. Okay, welcome back. Leviticus chapter 13 has 59 verses. And as you can see, the topic is leprosy, the laws concerning leprosy. Verse 2, we see a bright, clear spot versus a rising, a scab, or a bright spot. So they're giving us 3 options in the Mass, but we can see in the Sept it is one thing. It's a bright, clear spot. Um, verse 3, spot versus plague. And then it, the word it is a plague of leprosy. Actually, that says that in both, but it versus him. Oh, where's the word it? And then him. Oh, here it is. So the priest shall look upon it, the spot, and pronounce him unclean, versus the priest shall look on him. So no, he's not looking at him in general. He's looking at the spot in particular. Verse 4, clear and white, versus a bright spot, white. And then, but it is dark, the hair, talking about the hair. Um, if the hair is dark, that is omitted from the Mass. And then separate versus shut up. So it's important to notice that they actually mean separate. Shut up means shut them in a separate location. That's what it means. Doesn't mean shut their mouth. That's not what it means. So it actually means separate him. So it's just a difference of semantics. And moving on, verse 6, a mark versus a scab. We can see that for it is a mere mark versus a scab. So that's an interesting distinction. I'm not sure if a scab would be a mark, but that's what it says here. And that's a continuous difference you will see throughout this narrative. Verse 7, a bright spot. If the bright spot versus the scab. And then verse 8, how could a scab spread? So it says here the mark have spread in the skin. So my question is, how could a scab spread? That's not how scabs behave. So I believe it surely is a mark because scabs, if we're talking about granulation, uh, in the tissue when a wound starts to heal, scabs diminish in size. They don't increase in size. That's not the way scabs behave. So I do believe the sept is telling us what it really is. It's a mark that is growing. Verse 9, he shall come. Talking about the man who has leprosy. He shall come to the priest versus he shall be brought. So we're seeing in the Septuagint that the man, the leper, is responsible for himself. Uh, the Maz is saying, seems to imply at least, that other people are bringing him in or they're escorting him. And this would be poor infection control, to be honest. Uh, they would also most likely be infected by this man and spread the leprosy throughout the community if other people would bring him in. But it says here explicitly, he shall come to the priest. So he's the one responsible for himself, and he's not going to infect others. It's just not good protocol. And we can see even back in these ancient times, there was infection control uh, guidelines and policies, and this is expressed in this law, this incredible law, really, because even back then there was no awareness of containing an illness and quarantining. We're going to get to that quarantine topic very soon. Verse 10, white spot. White spot versus a rising white. It says here rising, if the rising white, but it is a white spot. And then it says sound, some of the sound part. So the word sound means solid, stable, free of injury or illness. So it is skin that is intact. It's not broken. Uh, it's not compromised. The skin integrity. And then we see here part of the quick flesh. Continuing on. So this is intact skin. There's no break in the skin. There's no wound. But then we see here in the mass it's saying raw flesh. So the sept is saying that this is new flesh. It's intact. The flesh is restoring itself. It's healing. Versus raw flesh. When we think of raw, or when we refer to raw in the medical field, raw means that the skin is no longer intact. That the the first layer of the derma has been it's no longer there, so it's exposed. This is an open wound. It's not a deep wound, but it's maybe like a level 1 wound, possibly. I'm just throwing that out there, but it's not intact. That's the point. And this will sting if you spill alcohol on it or something like that. That's gonna sting. But if we're talking about what the sept is saying, that it is sound skin, it's the quick flesh, it would not sting. Um, so it could mean an open wound, this raw flesh, and this would be infectious. But in any case, this is leprosy that is in the process of healing, but it remains contagious, as we see in the next verse, in verse 11. It is a leprosy waxing old in the skin of the flesh. Okay. The priest shall pronounce him unclean and shall separate him. Okay. Versus and shall not shut him up. So that's a huge difference. That's a big difference, continuous difference. So he will be separated, this leper. And the Mass is saying, you will not shut him up. You will not separate him. Why would you not do that? No, you should. You should. You need to take all precautions because the leprosy is still there, but it's just waxing old. He's still recovering. He's still in active recovery. You don't introduce him back into the community when it's still the leprosy is still present. It's still a health risk. And then moving on to verse 12. Oh, let me just pause it. Okay, so verse 12 says, come out very evidently. So if the leprosy should have come out very evidently in the skin versus break out abroad in the skin. So they're similar. However, there's more emphasis in the sept that it is evident, that is, it's easy to notice. It's very observable. And then we see in verse 13, look, the priest shall look versus shall consider. So if you consider, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's looking with his eyes. It just means he could be pondering it or thinking about it. No, you have to look at it. You need to look with your own two eyes and look for the physical manifestations of this plague, of this leprosy. And then the second half of the verse says, of the plague, the priest shall pronounce him clean of the plague. Um, and that has been omitted, I believe, but I do see it in both. So maybe that's actually not omitted. Let me just read this really carefully. The leprosy has covered all the skin of the flesh. Okay. He shall pronounce him clean of the plague. He shall pronounce him clean the plague. So of has been omitted. Okay. Okay. It's not a huge difference, but of has been omitted. The word of. Two-letter word. Verse 14. Quick flesh. The quick flesh versus the raw flesh. Again, that's continual difference. Verse 15. Sound flesh versus raw flesh. Verse 17. Notice if the skin is white, if the skin is turned white, he is now clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is not raw flesh or exposed flesh under the skin, like the Mass is telling us, but I believe it is better translated as new skin. New skin. I think that's probably how it should be translated, or at least intact skin. So the skin is white, and if the skin is not white, then if it's not intact, it's probably pinkish or reddish. Verse 18, ulcer versus boil. Okay, it's not a huge difference, but ulcers are open wounds. However, boils tend to have skin intact. Okay, so it can be a huge difference if you're looking at the medical definition. And then it says here, fiery versus reddish. Okay, I don't, it's in verse 19. Okay, never mind. Verse 19 is where we can find that difference there. And then verse 21, dark colored, referring to the ulcer, versus somewhat dark. Okay, and that's a continuous difference. Verse 22, of leprosy has been omitted. It is a plague of leprosy. So it's not just a plague in general, it is a plague of leprosy. It's very specific as to what kind it is. There are many types of plagues, many types of diseases and viruses. We know this. Verse 23, scar of the ulcer versus burning boil. 24, skin. We're going to read this part up to the word healed. There should be in his skin, if there should be in his skin, the part which is healed of the inflammation versus um, quick. If there is a quick that burns, have a white and bright spot. So that's the difference here. Quick that burns versus healed. So one is healed, one is burning. And then we see here very white versus just white. So there's a difference between very white and white. And moving on, 25, bright color. The hair being white is changed to a bright color versus white. So it is a color. I don't know if white is a color, but anyway, it does say the hair being white is changed to a bright color. So it's no longer white. That's what it seems to imply. And then it says inflammation broken out in the inflammation versus the burning. That's rather similar, I would say. And then 27, it has broken out. It has broken out in the ulcer. Um, if the spot be much spread in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a plague of leprosy. It has broken out in the ulcer. That has been omitted completely. That's a pretty significant difference. It wouldn't even say that it's broken out in the ulcer. So it's defining that's what a ulcer breaking out is. And then 28, scar versus rising. And then mark of the inflammation. It is the mark of inflammation versus the inflammation of the burning. That's an interesting difference. Essentially, the burning of the burning. That's what it means, because inflammation a uh, is what the body does in reaction to pathology or a condition in which it protects itself, and burning is one of the signs of inflammation. So it's a burning of the burning. That's redundant. Verse 30, scurf. It is a scurf. Scurf is a medical condition where thin, dry scales are detached from the epidermis, especially in an abnormal skin condition. So, dandruff would be an example of scurf versus a dry skull. So, we see dry skull in the MAS, and that's similar to a dry scalp. So, it's not a huge difference, I would say, but different words being used, scurf and dry skull. 31, yellowish hair versus black. Look at that. And there is no yellowish hair in it. Okay, so they're looking for yellowish hair, but if there's no black hair in it, then the priest shall separate him. Okay, so you can see the sept is saying you're looking for yellowish hair. If there is no yellowish hair, then you will set them apart. But if there is, then that's a good thing, I suppose. Verse 34, after the man's being shaved. Um, so it says here, the scurf is not spread in the skin after the man's being shaved. So you shave him down to take a better look at the skin condition. But it doesn't say in the MAS that you shave this man. But that's an important point. That's an important step to take to really do a proper assessment. So you can see the priest is pretty much like a nurse, like a doctor, is doing skin assessments. They are kind of like a physician in a lot of ways, and especially in this when it comes to leprosy. Verse 37, remain before him, but if a scurf remain before, brackets him, in its place, versus be in his sight, at a stay. Okay, that's an interesting difference. Verse 39, bright whiteness versus darkish white. Okay, I've never heard of something so ridiculous. Darkish white. Okay, I don't know what that means, but bright whiteness, we're going to go with that. And then 39, continuing, tetter. The word tetter, it is any of various vesicular skin diseases. So ringworm, eczema, herpes are examples. Uh, it is a tetter. Okay. If there's bright spots, it is a tetter versus it is a freckled spot. Okay. Well, that's a huge difference. Having a vesicular skin disease versus a freckled spot uh, kind of diminishes it when you say freckled spot. Just sounds like it's cute. Verse 42, fiery plague. Wow, it sounds really torturous. Versus a reddish sore, and that's a continuous difference. Okay. Okay, welcome back. Uh, so the next topic is masks and quarantine. No, I'm not talking about 2020. I'm talking about Leviticus chapter 13. It's actually talking about this. So let's look at this closely. Verse 45, ungirt, his garments ungirt versus rent, so ripped. And then it says here, let him, this is talking about the leper who has the plague, let him have a covering put upon his mouth. Okay, it's saying upper lip. How can you just cover your upper lip like that? Guess you do that. No, you're covering the whole mouth. This is basically a mask. This is the first instance I've ever heard in the whole Bible for someone to wear a mask to cover one's mouth in the case of being infection, in the case of being infected, I should say. So notice that it's the leper wearing the mask. It's not all of Israel. All of Israel is not wearing a mask. It's only the one who's sick. So that's an interesting thing. I'm not saying that it's wrong to wear a mask. I'm only saying in this specific case of leprosy, the leper wears the mask. But I suppose in other cases, when it comes to infection protocol, yeah, you would wear a mask to protect yourself, even if you're not sick. If there's something in the air, like radiation, for example, or an airborne disease, so you want to take all precautions. But that's an interesting thing regarding infection control. This is the word of the Creator. He's saying, cover your mouth with a mask. So if the children of Israel complained about it, if they said, oh, you're restricting our freedoms because we have to wear a mask, Yah is saying, if you don't do it, you're going to die. You're going to get leprosy. I don't think that's unreasonable, but it's important to notice that who is wearing the mask? It's the leper in this case, and he's also separated from the community, so he's not mingling with them. So this is the wisdom of our Father. It's incredible. And just as the heavens are above the earth, his ways are above our standards too. And you can see this just using this example of masks in quarantine. He's doing it in such an efficient and wise way. And we don't even know what we're doing most of the time. Thousands of years after this, we're still not doing things in the right way. Quarantine actually means 40 days, not 14 days. So, anyhow, let's continue on. It says here, he shall be called unclean in verse 45. So the person wearing the covering on his mouth, versus just saying unclean, he shall cry unclean, unclean. No, this isn't some kind of medieval thing where your town crier saying, I'm unclean, I'm unclean. No, you just call him unclean because he won't be in the town. He won't be there crying unclean, unclean. He's going to be uh, basically labeled as unclean, not like a social stigma in terms of it's like an insult. No, you're saying this out of public safety. That's what it is. Public safety. Verse 46. It says here, all the days in which the plague shall be upon him, the leper, being unclean, he shall be unclean. Referring back to 45. So he's going to be called unclean and he will be unclean. He shall dwell apart. His place of sojourn shall be outside the camp. This is quarantine. That's what it means to be quarantined. You're not living with the rest of the community. You are separated until you get well. And you're not separating everyone from everyone. You're only separating the sick from the healthy. So that's an interesting principle here. Or not just interesting, it's very wise. You can see it's common sense. It should be common sense, but it's just not common anymore in our days. But I think it depends on the illness. I mean, some illnesses like are more uh, subtle than others. There may be no symptoms when it comes to some sicknesses, but we're talking about leprosy here. And it's saying that when it comes to leprosy, you separate the leper, the sick, you don't separate the healthy when it comes to leprosy. And then 47, flax versus linen. And then, so linen is made of flax. So those are just synonyms. Verse 48, warp, either in the warp or in the woof. So it says that in both translations. A warp is a foundation of the garment. And then the base woof, uh, in the woof is the base of the woven fabric. So that's not something I'm familiar with. So I had to look those up. That's what those terms mean, the warp and the woof. 49, he shall show it uh, to the priest versus he shall be showed. So you're seeing the difference between the sept where the leper is taking personal responsibility for himself versus a tattletale ratting him out. That's what it sounds like. He shall be showed to the priest. So someone else is doing it. Why would they do that? That's again, that's infection, going against infection control and public health. Verse 51. This is confirmed leprosy. It says here is a confirmed leprosy versus a fretting leprosy. Fretting means devouring leprosy. Um, verse 55. I mean, leprosy is already devouring. It's kind of redundant to even say that. So it makes more sense to say a confirmed leprosy. Okay. Because you're looking for these signs that are being outlined here, and they're being described because when you see them, that's how you confirm it. That's what it means. Verse 55, appearance versus color. Change it in its appearance versus in its color. Fixed in the garment. It is fixed in the garment from the foundation to the woven material. So the warp and the woof. Versus fret inward. It is fret inward, eaten from the inside. Bear within or without. Okay. I think they're pretty similar in terms of the way, even though it's using different terminology, it's a similar thing happening in verse 55. Verse 56, spot versus a plague. The spot be dark. And then dark, says here dark versus somewhat dark in 56. The spot be dark versus be somewhat dark. So is it dark or is it somewhat dark? It's pretty explicit that it is dark. It's not something like dark or somewhat dark. Verse 57, leprosy bursting forth. It is a leprosy bursting forth versus it is a spreading. No, it's not just a spreading, it's leprosy. Many things spread, but this is specifically leprosy bursting forth. And then the last verse we're looking at, verse 59, the last difference here, leathern article. It says here, this is the law of the plague of leprosy of a woolen or linen garment, either of the warp or the woof. So from the foundation to the woven material, or any leathern article. So leather, clothes made of leather, to pronounce it clean or unclean. Notice that interesting terms being used, kind of tying into the previous chapter where we looked at the animals which were clean or unclean. So we're looking now at human beings, specifically leprosy. And the difference in this verse is leathern article versus anything of skins. So I think that's rather similar, uh, unless you're looking at an animal that doesn't have leather. But I suppose leather and skins are pretty similar after all. So that's all I have to present for these two chapters. Thank you very much for your time. And until next time, you've been watching Secrets Revealed, the Holy Bible. Yeah, bless you.